The notion that an English seaside hotel should possess any atmosphere more sinister than damp wallpaper and a persistent smell of haddock may appear to the untraveled mind a grotesque exaggeration, yet the Royal Crescent Hotel at West Wittering had, for 3 successive summers, contrived to be the subject of discreet but alarmed whisperings among its respectable clientele. The source of the gossip was not the cook, whose fish sauces were frankly homicidal, nor the waiters who practiced an advanced form of passive resistance in all dealings with guests. It was a bedroom, room number 16. It had acquired a reputation, as rooms will, for being somehow, what was the word, unlucky. A visiting canon had suffered a fatal seizure there in August of the previous year. A wealthy widow had been discovered in the same chamber 6 months later, apparently suffocated in her sleep. Both deaths were attributed by the coroner to natural causes, but tongues wagged, as tongues do, with the suggestion that the room itself was unwholesome. Guests requested removal from it. The management, anxious to dispel superstition, made a point of lodging persons of unimpeachable robustness in number 16. Thus it was that Lord Peter Wimsey, arriving for what he declared a bracing fortnight of sea air and detective abstinence, found himself conducted by a flustered manager to that precise apartment. "Begging your pardon, my lord," said the man with a perspiring bow, "but in light of certain, rumors, we thought it would be, reassuring if a gentleman of your distinction were to occupy the chamber." Lord Peter paused in the act of adjusting his monocle, surveying the unfortunate creature with a look compounded of amusement and faint pity. "My dear fellow," he said, "if you are desirous of having me expire in the night, you should at least have the decency to provide a decent claret for the funeral baked meats. Still, I accept the challenge. Nothing so bracing to the digestion as sleeping in a room with a reputation. One never knows. One might even encounter a ghost. And if not, there is always the haddock." He sauntered up the narrow staircase, with Bunter in attendance, his long figure swaying lightly, like a man strolling into a play he had seen performed before. The chamber proved disappointingly ordinary. The bedstead was of an age to creak in protest against any undue emotion. The curtains hung with a faint smell of old sea mist, and the wallpaper offered a faded pattern of roses which gave the impression of blushing under observation. Wimsey examined it all with polite detachment. "Really, Bunter, I had expected at least a spot of mildew in the shape of a pentagram. Instead, we have only a cracked water jug. Still, the carpet is decently thick, and the view of the sea is almost romantic. We shall endeavor not to be smothered in our sleep." Bunter, who had long since resigned himself to his master's eccentricities, merely observed, "The mattress, my lord, appears to have been turned with uncharacteristic diligence. Shall I test the locks?" "By all means. If the room is cursed, it would be a pity not to afford it every opportunity." It was 2 nights later, after a storm of uncommon violence, that the hotel corridor was awakened by a scream from room number 16, and when the manager, pale as the starched collar he had forgotten to remove, burst in with a gaggle of guests behind him, they found the occupant of the adjoining chamber, a certain Mr. James Tolliver, solicitor of Gray's Inn, lying sprawled upon the carpet in Wimsey's room, dead. Lord Peter, seated in an armchair with his dressing gown about him, looked up with mild surprise. "Ah," he remarked, "you are just in time to observe that death, when it calls, has the most appalling manners. He has burst in here without so much as a knock." And so began the matter of the curse of room number 16. The little knot of dressing-gowned guests peered over one another's shoulders, whispering as though in a pew at matins. The hotel manager wrung his hands in futile protest at the impropriety of having a corpse upon the premises. as though the deceased Mr. Tolliver might have chosen a more considerate location for his collapse. Whimsy, entirely untroubled by the presence of death in his room, regarded the company with polite interest. "My dear manager," he observed, "you are looking at me as though I had personally bashed the poor fellow over the head with my euthydemus. I assure you I have never yet murdered a solicitor, though I confess the temptation is not without precedent." Bunter had already crouched by the body, his narrow eyes flicking with military precision over the dead man's collar, cuffs, and carefully folded cravat. "There is no mark of violence, my lord. His face is congested. The expression rather suggests, if you will pardon me, a sudden obstruction of the breath." The doctor summoned from the town, a small, bustling man who smelled faintly of tobacco, arrived within the hour and confirmed the suspicion of natural seizure, though with less conviction than might have been desired. "The heart, perhaps," he said, wiping his brow, "or a sudden stoppage of the windpipe. Nothing very uncommon." "Nothing uncommon," murmured Whimsy, "except, perhaps, that this is the third death of precisely that character to occur in this particular chamber. A room with such an appetite ought to be given a pension." The guests gasped softly. The manager begged that nothing of the sort be repeated, and that the matter be kept as quiet as possible for the reputation of the establishment. But Whimsy only smiled. "I always like to know whether a room is inclined to take liberties with my lungs. Don't you, Bunter? It gives one a certain advantage in choosing one's bedtime reading." The inquest was set for the following morning, but Whimsy, declining to retire, requested that the hotel staff assemble discreetly in the lounge. They came in twos and threes, faces pinched and lips tight, with the propriety of people who would rather have been anywhere else. First came Mrs. Rowbotham, the housekeeper, who assured his lordship with excessive dignity that her girls kept the rooms spotless and that she, personally, inspected number 16 after every guest. "Quite so," said Whimsy, his head cocked like a curious bird. "And did you notice anything, however trifling, on this occasion?" "Nothing, my lord. Everything in order, as usual." "Not a faint smell of something? Not a curtain drawn more tightly than its neighbor? Not a speck upon the carpet that refused to be coaxed up by the brush?" Mrs. Rowbotham stiffened. "I do not attend to fancies, my lord. The chamber was in perfect order." Whimsy thanked her and turned his monocle upon the chambermaid, a slight girl with anxious hands. "And you, Miss—" "Elsie, my lord." "Elsie, did Mr. Tolliver say anything to you, or look about him oddly, or object to the room?" She hesitated. Only he said as how the air felt heavy-like, my lord. But it were a stormy night, and I thought no more of it." Whimsy gave her a little bow of thanks, then inquired, with apparently idle curiosity, how often the mattresses in that particular room were turned. Mrs. Rowbotham bristled at the implication, while Elsie confessed it had been done just that morning, on account of the manager wanting it shown proper for your lordship. "And the key?" asked Whimsy gently. The porter produced it from his pocket with alacrity. "Always accounted for, my lord. I swear it never leaves my keeping except to be given to the guest himself." "Admirably conscientious," said Whimsy. "A key with such integrity deserves to be knighted." But he did not smile as he added, "And who, pray, had room number 16 before Mr. Tolliver?" The manager shifted uneasily. "A young lady, sir, Miss Fairley. She left 2 days ago. Perfectly well when she went, I assure you." "Perfectly well," repeated Whimsy thoughtfully. "And leaving no complaint behind?" "No curious remarks about the curtains, perhaps, or the window not staying open?" The silence that followed was of the sort which suggests that a perfectly innocent fact has suddenly become terribly compromising. The maid glanced down, then up again quickly. "She did say, my lord, as how the latch on the window was stiff. I forgot to mention it." "Most natural," said Whimsy smoothly. "A stiff window latch is rarely of interest to anybody, except perhaps to a man who suddenly finds himself unable to breathe." At this, even the housekeeper crossed herself involuntarily. Whimsy's expression, however, remained one of mild amusement, as though he were cataloguing butterflies rather than deaths. When the staff had gone, Bunter closed the door and remarked, "You are convinced, my lord, that this is no ordinary seizure?" "My dear Bunter," said Whimsy, stretching himself languidly, "3 deaths in 1 room, all in the best of health beforehand? Either room number 16 is in urgent need of a new interior decorator, or it is being used, as a conjurer uses a hat, to conceal something of particular interest. I propose we begin by examining very minutely the question of air." And with that, he lit a cigarette, the faint blue curl of smoke drifting upwards as the storm rumbled distantly out to sea. Whimsy's declaration that the room itself must be tested was greeted by the manager with all the fervor of a man invited to watch his own house burn down. Yet Whimsy, untroubled, insisted. The following morning he appeared at breakfast cheerful, quoting Horace with the air of a man who had spent the night in a comfortable library rather than under the shadow of sudden death. The guests, meanwhile, had their own theories. A retired colonel at the next table whispered of foul play by foreign agents, while his wife maintained that it was clearly the result of suppressed gout. 1 or 2 murmured about the curse, lowering their voices as though the hotel itself might overhear. After coffee, Whimsy strolled casually into the smoking room, where Inspector Arbuthnot, dispatched from Chichester, had set up his little camp with notebooks and official gravitas. Arbuthnot had the heavy-jawed earnestness of a man who suspects a criminal behind every lamppost and feels cheated when the lamppost proves innocent. "I suppose you'll be saying it's murder," he growled with a glance at Whimsy's languid figure. "My dear Inspector," said Whimsy, selecting a cigarette with the delicate precision of a connoisseur, "I never say anything until the evidence obliges me. At present, I merely suggest that the deceased gentleman was singularly inconsiderate in choosing so inconvenient a spot to expire." "Natural causes," said Arbuthnot firmly. "You heard the doctor. His heart gave way." "Undoubtedly," agreed Whimsy, blowing a faint plume of smoke. "The heart is frequently implicated in death. In fact, I would go so far as to say it never survives the occasion." The inspector glared. "Well, if you're so sure it's unnatural, perhaps you'll be telling me who had cause to wish him ill. I've made inquiries. The man had no enemies. A quiet, respectable solicitor, here for the sea air." "Respectability," murmured Whimsy, "is the most suspicious trait of all. Still, let us humor your demand. Did you happen to notice the lady with the strikingly scarlet beads, seated 2 tables away at breakfast?" Arbuthnot frowned. "Mrs. Travers, widow, perfectly harmless." "Widow, yes," said Whimsy, "and a widow, I think, of no small determination. I observed her gaze resting on Mr. Tolliver with what I might describe as, shall we say, retrospective intensity. One might almost have supposed she had known him before." The inspector snorted. "Nonsense, she only arrived yesterday." "True, but London and Chichester are not the sole arenas for acquaintanceship. There are clubs, charities, and, dare I suggest, solicitors' offices." As though conjured by the remark, Mrs. Travers herself drifted in, a woman of perhaps 40, handsomely dressed, her face pale beneath a determined shade of rouge. She acknowledged Whimsy with a polite inclination of the head, then, seeing Arbuthnot, hesitated. "My dear madam," said Whimsy, springing lightly to his feet, "permit me to assure you of our profound sympathy in the disturbances of last night. Such shocks are most distressing." She thanked him in a low voice, eyes darting toward the inspector. Arbuthnot, scenting quarry, pounced. "I understand, ma'am, that you were acquainted with Mr. Tolliver." A faint flush rose under the powder. I had dealings with his firm, years ago. He acted in a certain delicate matter, but I assure you I had no recent communication." "Indeed," Whimsy interposed smoothly. "How very interesting. I imagine a solicitor entrusted with delicate matters may acquire a most intimate knowledge of his client's affairs. So awkward when such knowledge lingers." Mrs. Travers stiffened. "You imply I hardly know what you imply, Lord Peter. I came here for rest. I should not have to endure suspicion." "Perish the thought," said Whimsy cheerfully. "I merely suggest that we poor mortals are often at the mercy of our past correspondents. Solicitors' ledgers, you know, are far less forgetful than their clients." She departed soon after, with a rustle of skirts that seemed to leave an unspoken protest behind. Arbuthnot scowled. "There's your motive if you want one," he muttered. "The woman's hiding something. I'll wager Tolliver knew too much. Blackmail, perhaps." "Perhaps," said Whimsy, examining the ash on his cigarette with absorbed interest. "Though I find it difficult to imagine Mr. Tolliver threatening anybody with violence. He struck me as the sort of man who would rather die tidily in another man's bedroom than make a scene. But if not her, who else? Nobody else here had a connection with him." "Connections," murmured Whimsy, "are like dust. They settle where one least expects them. Meanwhile, let us return to the matter of the window latch." Later that afternoon, Whimsy had Bunter fetch a candle and hold it close to the sill of the narrow window in number 16. The flame flickered sideways. "You observe, Bunter, that the air enters freely when the latch is not fastened. A draught, and a heavy one, in a chamber otherwise close. Tell me, what did you think of Mrs. Travers' perfume?" "Overpowering, my lord." "Precisely. Too overpowering. I wonder if our late solicitor found the air of this chamber, let us say, supplemented." Bunter said nothing, but his expression was one of grim understanding. "Still," continued Whimsy lightly, "we must not leap ahead of ourselves. At present Mrs. Travers provides us with a perfectly respectable red herring. It would be ungracious not to allow her the honor." And he turned back to the window, humming softly as the sea crashed below, the mystery of room number 16 deepening with every gust of the salt wind. The storm had blown itself out by the next morning, leaving the Royal Crescent Hotel washed clean in sunlight, as though the heavens wished to contradict the night's sinister events. Whimsy appeared at breakfast in excellent spirits, discoursing with a retired canon upon the comparative merits of Horace and Juvenal, and correcting a misquotation with such charm that the canon beamed instead of bridling. Inspector Arbuthnot, however, wore the look of a man whose boots had shrunk overnight. He approached Whimsy with an air of grim determination. "I've had the doctor's report," he said shortly. "No sign of poison, no bruising, nothing to suggest foul play." "Splendid," replied Whimsy cheerfully, buttering a roll. "We are clearly in the presence of a phenomenon of the highest respectability. Death, it seems, has adopted the manners of a gentleman, leaving no trace of his visit, merely borrowing the room for a moment before stepping out again." "Pass the marmalade, Bunter." Arbuthnot scowled. "I don't know what you're finding to laugh at. 3 deaths in one room is serious enough." "My dear Inspector," said Whimsy, "I laugh to keep from yawning. Nothing so tedious as a mystery which explains itself too quickly. Happily, this one appears to have a sense of theater." And theater was precisely what Whimsy set about producing. After breakfast, he requested that the chambermaids fetch him a stepladder, a measuring tape, and several candles, to the frank bewilderment of the staff. He paced the floor of room number 16 with the solemnity of a stage director, tapping at the wainscoting, examining the curtains, and holding the tape measure against the window frame as though preparing to hang a picture. "Curtains 2 inches too long, Bunter. One wonders whether they were made for the room or the room for them. Do you detect anything in that?" "Not at present, my lord," replied Bunter gravely, though his eyebrows twitched in a manner which betrayed amusement. Wimsey next turned his attention to the carpet, crouching to observe where the pile lay flattened. "Note this, Inspector," he said. "The carpet bears signs of recent dragging, though I dare say your eye was on the more dramatic furniture of the corpse last night. See, a faint trail leading from the bed toward the window, as though some weight had been shifted." Arbuthnot bent, muttering. "Could have been the chambermaid turning the mattress." "Possibly," agreed Wimsey with a gracious nod. "But why then is the depression deeper near the window, where no mattress has business to be? One must always respect the habits of carpets. They record our indiscretions more faithfully than any diary." He moved next to the clock upon the mantelpiece, winding it with delicate fingers. "Curious. It runs 3 minutes slow. A trifle, you say? But trifles, my dear Inspector, are the very substance of detection. 3 minutes may spell the difference between life and death, or, more pertinently, between being in one's own bed and collapsing inconveniently in another's." By now, several curious guests had drifted into the corridor, craning their necks to watch. Wimsey, as though addressing an audience, drew a candle from his pocket and placed it upon the chest of drawers. "Observe," he said, lighting it. The flame wavered, guttered, and bent sideways. "A draught, yet the window is closed. How does the air insinuate itself? And of what quality, I wonder?" He extinguished the candle with a quick puff and pocketed it. Arbuthnot looked exasperated. "You're wasting time with these theatrics, Wimsey. I'd rather have one solid lead." "You shall have it," Wimsey promised lightly, "but only after we have examined the habits of maids, the timetables of trains, and the peculiar passion of respectable widows for scarlet beads. Detection, Inspector, is like an omelette. It will not set without the oddest ingredients." Later that afternoon, Wimsey summoned Elsie again. "My dear child," he said with kindly gravity, "when you turned the mattress yesterday, did you happen to notice whether the window was open?" She shook her head, nervous. "No, my lord, it were shut, but stiff, as I said." "And when Mr. Tolliver came in last night, did he request anything? A jug of water? A glass, perhaps?" She hesitated. "He did ask for more matches, my lord." "Matches, very good. And you brought them?" "Yes, my lord." "Alone?" A pause. "Mrs. Travers was on the landing, my lord. She asked me the time." "Ah," said Wimsey softly, as though this were the most enlightening fact of the day. "A woman asking the time. How excessively curious when a clock sits in her own room. Thank you, Elsie. That will be all." When she had gone, Arbuthnot demanded, "Well, what do you make of it?" "I make of it," said Wimsey, lounging against the mantel, "that we must revise our chronology. The precise hour at which Mr. Tolliver sought his matches may be more important than the matches themselves. Tell me, Inspector, did you note whether Mrs. Travers' clock was slow, like this one?" Arbuthnot blinked. "How should I know?" "Precisely," said Wimsey with satisfaction. "And yet, I dare say it matters a great deal." He looked toward the window where the late sun struck the salt-stained glass, and smiled faintly, as though the room itself had whispered a secret for his ears alone. The Royal Crescent Hotel had, by the following day, settled into that peculiar hush of an establishment where scandal is being anxiously smothered under linen napkins. Guests spoke in lowered voices, the staff moved about with exaggerated propriety, and Inspector Arbuthnot went about muttering darkly of red herrings and fiddlesticks, his boots striking the passageways with unnecessary vigor. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, was in the pink of health and apparently in the best of spirits. He took a brisk morning walk along the damp promenade, purchased a penny newspaper, and returned whistling a few bars of the Mikado, as though seaside deaths were the merest garnish to his breakfast. After luncheon, he requested Arbuthnot's company in the smoking room. "My dear Inspector," he began, laying out a sheaf of hotel notepaper as though preparing for a game of bridge, "you and I must reconstruct the evening of poor Mr. Tolliver, with all the conscientiousness of an antiquarian piecing together a Roman mosaic. Shall we?" Arbuthnot, though bristling, agreed. "Very well," said Wimsey. At precisely 9:30, Tolliver retired to his chamber. This we know from the testimony of Elsie, who brought him a box of matches on his request. She places the time at a little after 9:30. Mrs. Travers, I remind you, inquired the time upon the landing. "Nothing in that," Arbuthnot interjected. "Perhaps not," said Wimsey equably, "but let us not dismiss trifles. The mantel clock in number 16, as I have already observed, is 3 minutes slow. Did you by chance check the clock in Mrs. Travers' room?" Arbuthnot flushed. "I had no reason." "Then permit me to supply one," said Wimsey sweetly. For if Mrs. Travers' clock were correct and Tolliver's was not, her innocent question about the time might acquire a significance she herself scarcely realized. Consider, a difference of 3 minutes may give or take an alibi. He marked the times neatly upon the paper. Next, at 10 precisely, the storm broke in earnest. Several guests reported being disturbed by the thunder. At that hour, no sound was heard from number 16, save, perhaps, the cry of a gull. By 10:30, our unfortunate solicitor had collapsed, for at 11 the manager, summoned by a scream, discovered him in my chamber. Therefore, the fatal moment lies between 9:30 and 10:30. Arbuthnot leaned forward, glowering. "That's a whole hour, Wimsey. Narrow enough for you?" "Patience, Inspector," said Wimsey. "The art of narrowing time is like that of trimming a mustache. One must proceed with caution, lest the whole face look lopsided. Now, who was abroad in the passage during that hour?" "Only the chambermaid and Mrs. Travers for a moment," Arbuthnot said reluctantly. "And myself, who am above suspicion," Wimsey added airily. "Now tell me, what did Tolliver do between retiring to his room and being discovered in mine?" "Impossible to say. Read a bit, perhaps." "Matches, Inspector," said Wimsey, wagging a finger. "Matches for what purpose?" His candlestick already supplied. Perhaps he wished to light more than one. "You mean gas? But the place has no gas lamps." "Just so. But one may light a candle in order to observe a draught. A curious proceeding for a man seeking only sleep, don't you think?" Arbuthnot shifted uneasily. "And what of the window?" pursued Wimsey. "Elsie swears it was stiff. Yet the candle I placed yesterday bent toward it most obligingly. A draught must have an entry and an exit." "Then what's your conclusion?" demanded the inspector. "My conclusion, dear fellow," said Wimsey, "is that our solicitor spent part of that hour attempting to make himself comfortable in a room which refused him. He opened the window, or attempted to, and discovered the latch a trifle reluctant. Whether he succeeded we cannot yet say, but it is certain that at the moment of his collapse, the air in that chamber was less than wholesome." They were interrupted by Bunter, who announced with imperturbable calm that Mrs. Travers had asked to see Wimsey in the lounge. She received him with visible agitation. "Lord Peter," she said in a low voice, "this gossip must stop. My name is being whispered about already. You understand, I cannot be dragged into a scandal. I beg you to assure the inspector of my innocence." "My dear lady," said Wimsey gently, "innocence is a pearl beyond price, but it will not be secured by begging. Tell me instead, what did you and Mr. Tolliver discuss the last time you met?" Her lips tightened. "I cannot tell you. It was private." "Private," repeated Wimsey thoughtfully. And yet privacy is precisely what this room denies us. You may take my word for it, Mrs. Travers, that Tolliver's last hour was shared, though not perhaps in the manner you imagine. Thank you, that will do." She rose with a trembling air. "You are cruel, Lord Peter, cruel." "On the contrary," he said softly, "I am only exact." When she had gone, Arbuthnot muttered, "So she admits a connection. That proves it." "On the contrary," said Wimsey, folding his notes, "it proves only that we have not yet reached the heart of the puzzle. The times, Inspector, the times. Let us first be certain of them, and the rest will fall into place like dominoes." And as the sun sank over the channel, Wimsey stood at the window of room number 16, gazing thoughtfully at the latch, as though measuring not merely minutes but the breath of the dead man himself. It was late evening before Wimsey reappeared in the lounge, having spent several hours closeted in room number 16 with Bunter, the window latch, and a series of candles which had reduced the chamber to a faintly ecclesiastical gloom. When he emerged, his manner was so light-hearted that Inspector Arbuthnot grew instantly suspicious. "You've found something," the inspector accused, "and you're keeping it back." "My dear Arbuthnot," said Wimsey, dropping into an armchair with languid grace, "I have found a number of things, most of them exceedingly dull. A spider's web behind the curtain, a disobliging nail in the skirting board, and a curious difference in the depth of dust upon the top of the wardrobe, hardly sufficient to bring the gallows into play." The inspector growled something unprintable, but Wimsey only smiled and called for a glass of sherry. It was the post, however, that altered the complexion of the case. Among the morning's letters delivered to the hotel was one addressed to Mr. James Tolliver, marked private and urgent. The porter, in flustered innocence, handed it instead to Wimsey, who studied the neat solicitor's hand on the envelope, with an eyebrow delicately raised. Arbuthnot, upon discovering the error, was about to order it sealed away, when Wimsey observed mildly, "It seems a trifle late for privacy, don't you think? And since the gentleman is regrettably unable to read it himself, one of us must make the sacrifice." He slit the envelope with his finger and drew out a single folded sheet. The inspector bristled but read over his shoulder all the same. The letter was brief but astonishing. "My dear Tolliver, if you persist in your intention to come down to West Wittering, I must warn you that certain facts, known to you and fatal to me, will inevitably be discussed. I cannot allow this. For your own sake, I beg you, leave the matter in silence. I implore you, do not attempt to speak of it. Yours in fear, H.T." "H.T.," repeated Arbuthnot, frowning. "Who the devil?" "Mrs. Travers," said Wimsey softly. "Harriet Travers. How charmingly candid she has been, after all." Arbuthnot smacked the table. "So she admits it. She had a past with him. Something shameful, I'll warrant. He threatened exposure. She panicked and—" "Tut, tut," said Wimsey, examining the paper with delicate fingertips. "You gallop too fast, Inspector. Note the trembling of the hand, the uneven ink flow. A letter written in agitation, certainly, but is it the letter of a murderer or of a woman desperately afraid of what another may reveal?" He folded it thoughtfully. "Besides, if she wished to prevent him coming, would she not have acted sooner? The poor man was already here." Bunter entered at that moment with a discreet cough. "I have made inquiries, my lord. Mr. Tolliver was not, in fact, Mr. Tolliver." "Indeed?" said Wimsey with a spark of interest. "Do proceed." "He practiced under that name, my lord, but his baptismal register shows him as James Cattermole, the illegitimate son of one Henry Cattermole of Shoreham. He assumed the name Tolliver when he was articled, perhaps for respectability's sake. His true identity was little known, save among certain legal records." Wimsey's monocle gleamed. "A double life, Bunter, as sure as Juvenal railed at Roman hypocrisy. Our solicitor was a man with a secret, past, respectable on the surface, but with roots in soil less clean. Arbuthnot looked both triumphant and confused. So Mrs. Travers knew him before under his true name. That ties them up neatly. Neatly enough to be suspicious, murmured Whimsy. And yet, I wonder whether the noose is for her or for him. Tell me, Inspector, does a man with a concealed identity risk his respectability merely to take a seaside holiday? Or does he come because the risk has already been forced upon him? He rose, pacing lightly. Consider, the letter warns him to stay away for fear of a revelation. He comes regardless. Either he is foolhardy or he believes himself stronger than the threat. Why? What hold had he, or believed he had, over Mrs. Travers, or perhaps over someone else? Arbuthnot muttered. Blackmail, as I said. Or confession, said Whimsy quietly. The distinction, Inspector, may mean the gallows for the wrong person. We must discover what Mr. Tolliver, Cattermole, meant to reveal. Until then, our cursed chamber remains merely the theater of a play whose plot we do not yet know. That evening, as the tide receded over the shining sands, Whimsy stood again at the window of room number 16, holding the letter up to the fading light. On the paper, faintly impressed though invisible to Arbuthnot's eye, were the indentations of words written on a preceding sheet. Ah, he murmured with satisfaction. So there was more to say after all. And the smile that touched his lips was both amused and faintly grim, as though he had glimpsed the shadow of the truth, moving behind the polite curtains of the Royal Crescent Hotel. The following morning dawned gray and listless, as though the very sea had grown weary of battering the shingle. Whimsy, however, appeared at breakfast with a sparkle in his eye that suggested the contrary. He greeted the startled chambermaid Elsie with the courtesy of a courtier, and then devoted himself to kippers with such relish that Inspector Arbuthnot, watching sourly, muttered something about the manners of a man picnicking at a funeral. When the plates were cleared, Whimsy requested Elsie's presence in the smoking room once more. She came timidly, twisting her apron between her fingers. "My dear child," said Whimsy gently, "you recall fetching matches for Mr. Tolliver the night he died." "Yes, my lord. Pray tell me, did you strike one before handing them to him?" Elsie's eyes widened. "Why, yes, my lord, to see if they'd light proper. Some of the boxes are damp." "Excellent honesty," said Whimsy approvingly. "And where did you strike it?" "On the mantel, my lord." By the clock, Whimsy turned to Arbuthnot with a look of triumph. "You see, Inspector? That explains the faint scorch mark I discovered yesterday upon the edge of the marble. Our good Tolliver did not himself test the matches at once, else the mark would have been fresh. He lit his candle later, when the hour was closer to his collapse." Arbuthnot grunted. "A trifle." "Trifles," said Whimsy with mock solemnity, "make perfection, and perfection is no trifle. Mark me, the difference between 9:30 and 10 may be the difference between Mrs. Travers' presence in the passage and her absence. You may hang a man or save a woman upon such minutes." Elsie, emboldened, added, "I remember too, sir, when I come back with the matches, the window was open a crack. I thought as how Mr. Tolliver must have managed the latch hisself." There was a little silence. Arbuthnot frowned heavily. Whimsy smiled. "My dear Elsie," he said softly, "you are a treasure. For the latch, as you swore earlier, was stiff, yet now you say it stood open. Remarkable, is it not, Inspector, how a man in failing health should find strength for a task that baffled a healthy chambermaid?" "Then somebody else opened it for him," said Arbuthnot grimly. "Precisely, and with the window came air, my dear Inspector, of a sort not wholly compatible with human lungs. Do you recall my candle's curious behavior? Consider, too, the overpowering perfume of Mrs. Travers. A convenient disguise for any fainter odor, perhaps? He rose abruptly, his tall figure pacing the carpet's faint trail toward the window. "Bunter," he called, "the carpet again, if you please." Together they examined the worn track, the faint depression near the sill. "It was moved, my lord," Bunter confirmed, "between the time I brushed it last morning and when we entered at the alarm, dragged outward toward the window." "Precisely," said Whimsy, "and our solicitor, collapsing, fell across it. Thus the peculiar flattening. Death, you see, is an untidy tenant." Arbuthnot's eyes narrowed. "So she, or whoever opened the window, let something in and left the room. That's your idea?" "Not let something in, Inspector," said Whimsy softly, "but rather let something out. The question is, what?" At that moment Mrs. Travers herself entered, pale but composed. She addressed Whimsy with brittle calm. "Lord Peter, I can endure this no longer. The staff are whispering. The guests look at me askance. If you know something, tell it. If you do not, then cease tormenting me." "My dear lady," said Whimsy with a bow, "torment is the last thing I should wish upon you. Yet you, of all people, may help us. You see, the window was open when our unfortunate solicitor collapsed. You yourself remarked the latch was stiff. Did you perhaps notice it that evening?" Her face whitened. I cannot say. I hardly recall." But Whimsy interrupted gently. "You cannot recall because you dare not. Yet the truth will not be silenced. You saw the window open, you smelled the air, and you knew as well as I that Tolliver, Cattermole if you prefer, had at last discovered the means of his own undoing." She swayed, clutching the back of a chair. "Then it was not me. You believe I did not—" "Madam," said Whimsy softly, "you may have wished him silent, but you did not kill him. The room itself, with its cunning preparation, did that. And now we must ask ourselves, who had both the knowledge and the access to make so subtle a trap?" Arbuthnot stared. "You mean one of the staff?" "Or," said Whimsy, his eyes gleaming behind the monocle, "someone who knows the habits of the house even better. The question is not merely who hated Mr. Tolliver, but who understood the geography of room number 16 as though it were a stage set for a play. And, Inspector, I think we already know our stagehand." The silence that followed was charged, as though the room itself listened. Whimsy smiled faintly, the very picture of a man amused by the elegance of his own deductions, while beneath his irony lay a thread of steel. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lamps flickered to life, along the Crescent's promenade, Lord Peter Whimsy summoned the entire hotel staff to the lounge. The air was thick with a peculiar tension, as though the very walls anticipated a revelation not altogether welcome. Inspector Arbuthnot looked on with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect, while Mrs. Travers sat apart, her scarlet beads clutched tightly in trembling fingers. The guests, too, had been invited, their curiosity piqued by the promise of a resolution, or at least some entertainment. Whimsy stood before them, tall and impeccable, a faint smile playing upon his lips as he unfolded the sheet of paper with the carefully mapped-out timeline. "My friends," he began, "we find ourselves in the midst of a mystery not only of death, but of deception and duplicity. It is the habit of the English to keep their secrets well hidden behind a veil of civility. Yet, as we have seen, civility is but a mask, sometimes a thin one, sometimes a thick." He moved with the precision of a conductor, directing attention to the large drawing of room number 16 pinned to the wall. "Consider the geography of this chamber, a room with a window latch both stiff and, on occasion, yielding, a carpet marked by a peculiar trail, a clock 3 minutes slow, and most importantly, a scent of overpowering perfume and something less definable, something no doubt intended to conceal rather than reveal. Turning to Bunter, he asked for the candle once more. The faithful valet lit it carefully and held it near the window. The flame bent toward the gap, flickering and pulling as though in a silent breeze. "Observe," said Whimsy, "how even the air conspires to tell us the tale." He paused, then continued with a dry wit. "Now, to understand how this breeze was manufactured, one must consider the habits of those who know the house best." From the back, a murmur arose as he cast a glance towards the butler, Mr. Snell. The man's jaw tightened, but his expression remained polite. Whimsy smiled faintly. "Mr. Snell, you have served here for over a decade, have you not?" "Yes, my lord." "And you are familiar with every lock, every hinge, every secret passage this venerable edifice holds?" "Everyone, sir." "Splendid. Then you will appreciate how the latch, though stiff, might be manipulated." Snell said nothing, his eyes betraying only a flicker of irritation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whimsy continued, "we shall now enact the final scene." With the assistance of Bunter and the butler himself, Whimsy arranged the room as it had been on the fatal night. The carpet was rolled back to expose the trail. The window was closed with measured care, the latch resisting as before. Then, in a quiet voice, he narrated the sequence. How the victim entered requesting matches, attempting to open the window against its obstinate latch, and finally collapsing where the carpet lay disturbed. Whimsy lit the candle and placed it on the mantelpiece. As expected, the flame bent strongly toward the window, the flickering shadow dancing upon the walls. "Now," said Whimsy, "let us observe the effects of a slight adjustment." With a subtle movement, Snell produced a small, thin piece of fabric, evidently a fragment of a glove, and slipped it under the latch. The window eased open just enough for the draft to enter, but not so far as to be noticeable at a glance. The room filled with the faint scent of lavender mixed with something metallic and faintly acrid. "This," said Whimsy, "was the trap. The draft would carry a subtle poison, nicotine oxide perhaps, into the chamber. Our solicitor, weakened by heart trouble, would succumb without a struggle." Arbuthnot's mouth fell open. "But how did you know?" "Because, Inspector, only one person knew the house and its secrets well enough to contrive this. The man who tended the windows, knew the latch's weakness and moved unseen through the corridors at will." He looked directly at Snell. The butler's face paled imperceptibly. "Mr. Snell," Whimsy said quietly, "the game is up." The assembled guests murmured. Mrs. Travers clutched her beads more tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and apprehension. Snell remained silent for a moment before finally lowering his gaze. "Yes, my lord," he said softly. "I feared he would ruin us all." "And so you acted," said Whimsy, "not out of malice, perhaps, but out of a desire to protect secrets best left buried." The butler gave a weary nod. Inspector Arbuthnot stepped forward to take Snell into custody, while Whimsy returned to his chair with a faint smile, lighting a cigarette as if to celebrate the end of a long play. The lounge, dimly lit and charged with anticipation, seemed to contract as Lord Peter Whimsy rose to his feet. The assembled guests and staff leaned forward, the dull murmur of whispered speculations falling silent beneath the weight of his presence. "My friends," Whimsy began, his voice calm and deliberate, "we stand at the conclusion of a curious tragedy, one that might well have been penned by the most melodramatic of playwrights, were it not for the sober facts which bind us to reality." He gestured toward the diagram of room number 17. "Let us retrace the steps of that fatal night. Mr. Tolliver, who, as we have discovered, lived a double life under the less respectable name of James Cattermole, retired to his chamber about 9:30. He requested matches not merely as a convenience, but as a means to investigate an unfortunate circumstance, a stubborn window latch, which his chambermaid described as stiff. Whimsy's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Mrs. Travers, whose fingers twined nervously in her lap. He was aware that the window posed an obstacle, yet he attempted to open it, perhaps seeking fresh air or, as I suspect, sensing a presence he wished to expel. The butler, Mr. Snell, sat rigid, eyes lowered but alert. Now, here is the crux. The latch, though resistant, was compromised, not by accident but design. The introduction of a fragment of fabric carefully placed beneath it allowed the window to be eased open just enough to admit a subtle draft. Whimsy paused for effect, lighting a cigarette with his usual flourish. This draft carried with it a lethal agent, an insidious poison introduced through the window's open slit. Our victim, already weakened by heart disease, succumbed quietly to this airborne toxin. Inspector Arbuthnot nodded grimly. But who, Whimsy continued, had both the knowledge of the house's secrets and the motive to orchestrate such a crime? He turned sharply toward Mr. Snell. The butler, sir, said Whimsy quietly, is uniquely placed to manipulate the environment. Years of service have made him familiar with every lock, every draft, every passage. The victim's past threatened to unravel secrets best kept hidden, and it was this threat which compelled a desperate act. Snell's eyes lifted, meeting Whimsy's. Your loyalty is commendable, said Whimsy, but misplaced. The fabric fragment, the subtle draft, the altered timeline, all betray the hand of a man who sought to protect the establishment's reputation at any cost. He turned to the room at large. And yet this crime is not one of malice alone. It is rooted in fear, fear of exposure, of ruin, and of scandal. Mrs. Travers, who sought to silence Mr. Tolliver, was caught in a web woven by this dread. Mrs. Travers looked up, her voice trembling. I only wished to keep the past buried. I never sought harm. Indeed, Whimsy said gently, and it is precisely such human frailty that often drives the most terrible acts. He concluded with a wry smile. So let us remember, the devil is not in the details, but in the timing, and thanks to the keen observations of all involved, especially the reliable Elsie, we have uncovered a plot as neat as any sonnet and as dark as a Gothic novel. But it is a plot solved by reason, not superstition. Inspector Arbuthnot moved forward to take Snell into custody, while the guests murmured in a mix of shock and relief. Whimsy settled back into his chair, lighting another cigarette, and mused aloud. Now all that remains is to await the morning train and the comfort of a good cigar. The dawn crept cautiously over West Wittering, casting long, hesitant shadows upon the Royal Crescent Hotel. The air was crisp, filled with the salt tang of the sea and the faint promise of a new day, one that would no longer bear the weight of whispered accusations and stifled fears. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the window of his room, gazing out at the shingle beach where gulls wheeled in their eternal dance. Beside him, Bunter poured a cup of tea with the practiced ease of a man who has seen one too many mysteries unravel before breakfast. Another case concluded, sir, Bunter observed quietly. Whimsy exhaled a slow plume of smoke, the embers of his cigar glowing faintly in the early light. Yes, Bunter, a curious little tale stitched together with secrets, lies, and a window that refused to open without a fight. Quite Gothic in its own way, though sadly bereft of ghosts. Bunter nodded. And no supernatural explanations to confound the inspector's logic, my lord. Indeed, Whimsy replied with a dry smile. I dare say that if the supernatural ever did venture forth from its crypt, it would do well to hire a solicitor and disguise itself as a respectable mortal. He turned, eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. Mrs. Travers, poor woman, was less a villain than a victim of circumstance, and Mr. Snell, who had the temerity to mix loyalty with lethal resolve, shall find himself acquainted with the legal system, where the truth is, perhaps, the most unyielding adversary of all. The butler's footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor below, a reminder that the wheels of justice were already beginning to turn. Whimsy's gaze drifted back to the sea, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore as if to punctuate the end of the tale. "One learns, Bunter," he said softly, "that the human heart is a far stranger country than any Gothic castle, and while shadows may dance upon its walls, the light of reason will always find a way in." Bunter smiled. "A fitting thought, my lord." Whimsy gave a final drag on his cigar and crushed it in the ashtray. "Well then, let us prepare to depart. The morning train waits, and with it, the sweet prospect of returning to a world where mysteries, thankfully, are less common than bad cigars." As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped away from the window, his figure tall and composed, a solitary sentinel of reason amid a world ever poised between darkness and light.